Good morning, everybody. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to elders past and present. I have the role of overseeing the NDIA's whole of government transition for the state. So I get the privilege of seeing a wide variety of information from a wide variety of sources and people. So it is my pleasure to be able to provide you with a snapshot of information that is actually openly available, mostly, but is not necessarily easily put together. So we've tried to put a booklet together for you which gives you a snapshot of what's happening. We've tried to collect it from the different sources to make it slightly more accessible for you to sort of see a picture. But all of the material is in the quarterly report, and if you haven't actually seen the quarterly report, which is in it's on the web, then I would highly recommend you go and see it and you keep track of it every quarter, because it has got very interesting information in it. The booklet that we have provided you with has got participant transition rates and demographics and other planned data in it. And as I speak, I'll refer to pages in that booklet so that you can connect to the sorts of things I'm saying from the booklet. Some of it will be on the presentation and some of it's not. But it is important probably to note that the information we're trying to discuss today is about what happened in year one and what that might mean for you in year 2 and year 3 in terms of the rollout, in terms of the business transitioning. So there's a few important pieces I just need to touch on about the data. So firstly, the bilateral data was data in terms of the number of participants that we're expecting to come into the scheme, was modelled by the NDIA, by the Commonwealth and by Queensland, all with a relatively similar outcome. And the information that was used for the bilateral was actually the Commonwealth data and their analysis in the end. It's important to understand that, because when we start talking about the trends look different to what was predicted. But it was pretty consistently calculated from a number of different areas. The other thing that's worth touching on is that existing Queensland information is provided to the NDIA. Most of you will understand this, but we electronically transfer that in a secure way to the NDIA. But it's important to know that it's data that is complete to the NDIA data standard and has a number of fields in it which are called critical to load. And phone number of the participant is a really important critical to load field. So if the data that we have does not have a phone number for the participant or for our existing client, then we don't provide that data to the NDIA. So even though they might be an existing client, if we don't carry that data, we can't transfer it to the NDIA. So there's little bits of information like that are quite important. I say this in this forum because if you are an existing provider and you have clients, then the better the quality of data that we have to transfer to the NDIA, the more likely the experience of the participant will be smoother and easier. There is the existing Commonwealth client information is provided in the same way to the NDIA. They do have probably more challenges in terms of the quality of their data than the state does, and it depends on the program type that they have. So probably the data being provided to the NDIA is more fulsome from the state than the Commonwealth are currently able to achieve, but they are certainly working on trying to improve that. The other important point here is what defined programs are. It's probably a piece of language that you have heard. A defined program is where participants really have had their eligibility already assessed to the same standards that the NDIA would expect. And so they're predominantly the specialist disability support programs. They're predominantly the programs that are part of the Department of Communities, Child Safety and Disability Services, although there is one health program, which is the HASP program. So anyone who is in those programs, they don't need to have their eligibility, their disability eligibility assessed. They still need to ensure the NDIA will still check age eligibility and residence eligibility, but the disability aspects of their eligibility is not going to be assessed. And so in the way the bilateral is described, it talks about existing clients, so those are the groups that I've just talked about, and then other. And within the other grouping is the unique Commonwealth clients, and when I say unique, it means that they're not in a state-funded program as well, and new participants. So those are people who have never really touched the state and or Commonwealth systems. They may have, but it would have been a long time ago, and they're not a regular participant in any service at the moment. And there is a surprisingly large number in Queensland that we are expecting to roll in who are in that grouping. Now, you will all know probably of individuals who probably are in those groupings, and this is a big opportunity for those people to come in. So the expected intake, as Michael had been talking about, was it is written in the bilateral, and we expected in year one that there would be around 15,000 participants coming in year two around 16,000 participants coming in, and then year three around 60,000 participants. So it's that J curve, and in your booklet on page 5, there's a bit of a graph that shows, that's a graphical representation to show that, and to show that significant increase in the third year transitioning. It's also trying to show you in that diagram that there's a differentiation between existing and other. So we were expecting approximately a 50-50 roll-in from the two sides. The modelling and the costing in the bilateral was done on that basis, and that's because the state is expecting so many other participants to actually come into the scheme. So, what's happening? So this graph shows the estimated participants that were described in the bilateral, so that 15,000, approximately 15,000 participants, that's the top blue line. The lower paler blue line is what's actually happened. That's the number of participants who have actually come into the scheme in this year. So it is the areas that have transitioned in the year were the Greater Townsville area, the Greater Mackay and the Greater Toowoomba. It is important to note that in these numbers are also the Ipswich participants who rolled in early. So there's around 500 in the early Ipswich group as well. Now, what I just wanted to point out is the number of participants and what language you use and what's being counted can be quite tricky. So I'm just going to describe some of that because you will hear different numbers. The 7,249 participants living in Queensland is a number that was used quite a lot in July and August. Now that's the number of participants who are actually in Queensland with an active plan on the 30th of June 2017. So the quarterly report will actually describe a different number. So there are 7,188 participants had their plan approved in Queensland. So it's different because some of those people might have left Queensland and other people have come into Queensland. So, and of the 7,188 that had their plan approved in Queensland, actually only 7,161 were active at that point. So that means that there were 27 participants who are no longer active. Now, they might be no longer active because they've gone into the aged care system, or sadly they've passed away. So there's a number of reasons why you're not active anymore, and it's not that you've left the state. You can still be active in another state. So it's when we say numbers, the preciseness of how you describe those numbers is becoming increasingly important because it's quite a complex and difficult area to keep track of. Indicatively, the numbers are around 7,200, and indicatively the number in the state versus the number of approved in the state, the movement in and out, it's kind of even, but it's not absolutely even. So just be a wee bit careful when you're reading these numbers and just to understand exactly what they're saying. And the bilateral uses the Queenslanders who received their plan in the state. And we do know that there is quite a lot of participant movement. Actually, there's been a lot more participant movement than I think I ever expected in terms of seeing where people are coming and going, which I think is a really good thing, but it does make counting numbers very tricky. I think that's all I was going to say on that one. So I'm going to do now is just look at what that means in terms of where the participants are. So we've broken it down by transitioning areas. And this, there's graphs on this on page 9 in the booklet. So it's just trying to give you some sense of what actually is the pattern. We talked earlier that the majority of participants coming in are in fact existing participants. So that top right graph is showing you what the flow of the expected flow based on the bilateral of existing participants coming into the scheme would be, and then what the actual flow was, and that's the blue line. So you can see that it's pretty consistent to the blue line. It's a little bit below. There was a few months that was a very slow flow, and that was when the NDIA was having the IT, the technology challenges that they had, but then you can see they pretty rapidly picked up from that point on. But then when you look at the bottom left graph, which is the total, you can see that by far the majority of participants coming into the scheme are in fact the existing. The graphs that you have show existing, other, and then the total. I just on the slide pack put the two slides on rather than... So you can see 83% of the Townsville participants are in, and 58% in total are in. On this particular graph, you can see that the bilateral estimates flatten off. That's because the transition period for Townsville, according to the bilateral and when we expected that we would transition people in, ended at the end of January. So then it flattens off from that point on. So just moving on to the Mackay transition area. Again, kind of a similar pattern that you can see. What you will note here is that for the first 3 months and even 4 months, the existing participants were exceeding the bilateral estimate and then matched the bilateral estimate, and then it's trailed a little bit from that point. And then in total, so at this stage we have 63% of the estimate for existing participants in and 41% of total. The transitioning period for Mackay finished at the end of June, so understanding the pattern thereon might be a similar one from Townsville, but clearly we have to wait for that to occur to see. And then just moving to the Toowoomba area, and again, fairly similar sort of pattern. So existing participants are rolling in pretty quickly and pretty much according to the run rate expected from the bilateral. A little bit below, so it's 50%, 57% of estimate for existing. I think it's important to note that it's a much tighter time frame that Toowoomba was transitioning in, and we would need to see what the pattern is in the July, August, September flow. And then, and the total is 35% of the total. So the trajectories are a little different. So in summary, what this is really showing is that the overall number of participants are considerably lower than estimated. There are many more existing clients entering the scheme than estimated. So 3/4 of the participants are existing to 1/4 other. Existing clients do enter more quickly into the scheme. That's because we've largely provided the data to them. If you actually look at those existing clients in detail, then the people in defined programs actually roll in pretty quickly because their eligibility is assessed very quickly and they can get into the planning process faster. The other clients are a little slower, but still looks quicker than for other participants, but you can see that other participants are actually continuing to enter the scheme in an ongoing way. So what I was going to do now is just actually ask Rhys to come up, because that information prompts a number of questions, I think. And so we're going to attempt to work out what those questions might be. And Rhys and I are going to have a conversation about that.
Thank you. Please hold your applause to the end. I won't be too harsh. We looked at some of this data in QTAG and felt it was really important to share that with the industry. Not to tell you what to do with your business, but instead help you to inform what your strategy might be. So originally the bilateral contemplated the 14,000 in year one, and I think as an industry and as a business then we were prepared to double the market in size, or we were looking for market expansion and market growth. When we look at these real numbers now, it starts to paint a very different picture around what the market's looking like, and as a result we feel that's important for the industry to hear that information and to know about it. So the first graph that we looked at, where we see we have basically a 50% of numbers that were contemplated in the bilateral, is significant. That's huge, right? In terms of what that means. So why such a big gap?
Why such a big gap? We've wondered that too. There's a couple of things hiding in there, I think, is that other participants, it's largely existing that are rolling in. And other participants are slower. We do see, at the time the bilateral was negotiated, I don't think we understood necessarily that the other and the new participants would roll in as slowly as they have been. In fact, the conversations with the NDIA were how to manage the flow of participants in. We expected a lot more coming in a lot faster. And really I think it's highlighting that other participants are just waiting and watching a bit, and they'll roll in their own time. I think the Commonwealth's challenges with their data have made it harder for the Commonwealth clients in supporting there, but regardless, those participants could come in as new clients anyway. And I think that people are still just watching and waiting. I think it's probably harder than people expected in terms of the other participants coming in. They're struggling a bit more to actually gather their evidence, and that's the sort of anecdotal information we're hearing.
Yeah, I mean, we've often thought too, so we've known, for a long time there's been the school leavers or the early school leavers with disability who, haven't made it on the RON or have been ineligible previously, who are now eligible for NDIA, and how we're engaging them, or what sort of education piece there is for the agency around talking with schools and with early school leavers and school leavers to be able to engage them in the NDIA. And I think later on when you get to core supports and how all that's working, that could maybe be an alignment there. But that's up for other people to work at as well. Do you then think that the bilateral numbers that were calculated, so maybe there's two questions here, how were they calculated? How was that bilateral, how did that come about? And do you think these numbers are real?
So I'm not going to be able to explain how they were calculated in detail. Just that, as I mentioned earlier, the modelling was done by, I'll say some big brains. And they didn't use existing people using services because it was quite hard to merge the data sets and understand how many unique people were in there. But it was using statistical analysis that was available at the time. The fact that the three areas, the Commonwealth and the NDIA and the state, did similar styles of modelling and came to similar numbers, I think is important. Will we get to those numbers? We've asked that question as well, and everyone's reasonably confident that we will still get to the numbers described in the bilateral, but it will take longer than we were expecting. People aren't going to roll in on the timeframes that we were expecting.
And I think if we look at the Townsville graph that you had there, so there's actually a line Yep, there. So the end of transition there at January 2017. So if we take that line and we're looking at the pink or the magenta graph, you can see that there's still an upward trend there, right? So there are still people entering the scheme in Townsville, but it's just slower than what the bilateral had contemplated. So, you could make the assumption, I guess, back of the envelope, that we're looking at, it's about 24 months to get to about the 50% mark of what the bilateral was. And so then what then do we as an industry or providers then do in terms of strategy, our investments in our capital works and our systems and our processes, whether we go hard at that, whether we slow it down, or whether we remain stable. And I think they're the sorts of thinking maybe that people need to take away from that.
I think, and on that point is, one of the questions might be, will this pattern continue? And
that was my question.
It was your question. Yeah. There we go. I'm getting good at this. So what we think, the trend certainly seems to be the same for Ipswich. Bundaberg's a bit early. But with LACs on the ground and operating, it's likely that there'll be an improved proportion of other participants coming in, but not necessarily a big bang. So I think that the trends will continue of other rolling in at a gradual but improving rate, and the existing participants will roll in quite quickly. They are the relatively easy group to initially find and work with and plan with. And it's actually, from a state perspective, as Michael was saying, it's very important that our state existing participants get into the scheme in the transition timeframes described, because that's when the state actually needs to give up the resources that it's got for those participants.
So one last question before you move on. Based on that and based on the numbers that are coming through, will we be transitioning other regions earlier? Will we be bringing forward those transition dates, do you think?
Do I think? There is no decision. The rollout is currently as per the schedule, and near the end of my presentation I will reiterate what that schedule is. But we are watching and monitoring the flows, and if there is a possibility of draw forward at some point, I'm sure that the government of the day will make that decision, and you'll be advised as soon as possible. We know that earlier information about that is better, but at this stage it is as per the schedule of the bilateral.
I'll let you carry on.
Thank you. Okay, so that's kind of giving you some sense of what's happening with the transition. It was intended to take it down a layer, because our transition is by area. It's not by program. It's not across the whole state. It's important to understand the trends and the impacts within those areas. The next areas that I'd like to talk about are in kind of the participant demographic grouping, and it's in pages 12 to 13 of your booklet. I thought that this was a particularly interesting graph, because it shows where the bulk of our participants, what their primary disability is. So 60% of our participants have their primary disability identified as intellectual disability or autism. And then the next biggest grouping is actually psychosocial disability, although there's quite a cluster between 5% and 7% with that ABI, other physical, other neurological. Actually, just while I'm touching on this, you'll see that between the graphics that we've provided you with and the graphics and or information that's in the quarterly report, sometimes we've created a graph of a table that the NDIA have published, and sometimes we've gone the other way, and that's just because we found it simpler to actually properly understand, because the details were working. So, and it gives you two views of it, so depending on whether you like graphs or you like tables, and have both sets of information with you to look at. The next part of participant demographics, which I think is interesting, is that there's a large proportion of participants, 40% are children, young people aged 0 to 18. So you've got in the document a chart on that as well. a large proportion of participants, 62%, are male. Now, that probably connects to the fact that 60% of participants have an intellectual disability or autism, but it's still it's an interesting and substantially higher than 50-50 of the population. The other important statistic, I think, is that 9.5% of the participants in Queensland are Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. And although that statistic is probably still too low for the number of people who have a disability in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, it's actually substantially better than the rest of the country, which is 5% participation rate. So it's an important statistic from that perspective. Wondering, Rhys, if you've got any observations on any of those?
Only that the important to remember, because we look at this participant demographic graph regularly, backwards. Important to note that's primary disability only, and so certainly for my organisation and a lot of others around is that a lot of the people that we support have dual or multiple diagnoses, and so we can't just rely on this graph to give an indication of the types of services and supports that we should either be developing or promoting or delivering that in fact it isn't a good indication of how you should be designing your service, I think, for the future. And so it really is about going back and doing deeper conversations with the people, your consumers and the people that you support around how the impact of multiple or dual diagnoses affect their services. And then probably just one other thing is English as a second language in the CALD community. And so recently the NDIA have talked about an improved framework and access approach to accessing translator and interpreter services. So we're hopeful then that that will improve people's access to the NDIA in terms of having a conversation.
That's right.
Yeah.
And at this stage there aren't statistics available on the percentage of those, but I know that the NDIA are looking at that and wanting to improve that. Okay, so plan data. So the next kind of, seem to have, yes, there we go. Cluster of information that I'll go through are pages sort of 14 to 17 of the booklet. This particular diagram is in the quarterly report, or it's either the quarterly report or the dashboard. But we just reordered it slightly to put all of the core services together and then all the capital and then the capacity building, because we thought that there was a nice clustering. But obviously what this really shows is that the vast majority of resources are going to core activities, so daily activities, social and civic. Small amount to transport and consumables, and you can also see capacity building for daily activities is quite a high percentage as well. So as you would probably expect, that's where the support in people's plans is going. This diagram isn't in the booklet. It was one that I identified after the booklet kind of went off to printing. And I just wanted to go through it. It's in the dashboard. And if you've got the dashboard, I didn't point out the dashboard, but the dashboard is a really good document as well. It's where the quarterly report is. And it's on page 2 of that dashboard if you're looking for it. This shows funding levels, the number of participants by funding levels and where they kind of cluster. So it's an interesting graph to see, because you can see between 30,000 and 50,000 and 50,000 and 100,000, that's where the bulk of the participants actually are. That's where the bulk of the funding is going, really. I do want to point out in this graph that the gradings at the bottom are different. So if you look at the graph, it goes, the first block is 0 to 5,000, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20, 20 to 25, 25 to 30. Then there's a leap. So then we go 30 to 50. So, and then 50 to 100. So they're different scales. And then you go back to 100 to 150, 150, 200, 200, 250, 200 plus. So just when you're looking at the graphs in both the dashboard and in the quarterly report, just sometimes you have to look at those scales because they sometimes move and they're not necessarily always consistent. And that can just, it doesn't give you wrong information, but it does make you have to think about what you're looking at a bit more carefully. So I partly wanted to put this diagram up because it's interesting to see where the bulk of the money is, but it's also interesting to just know and be careful when you're looking at the information because you can fall into little holes there. It is really, and as you would expect, there are very few very high packages, high value packages as well, so they're relatively small in number. The next diagram is plan data funding by primary disability, and I thought this was an interesting one because it shows its number of, or proportion of participants, so kind of an indicator of numbers, against the average package size. So it starts with spinal cord injury as the most expensive packages, but relatively no numbers of people. And then that we spike in the middle where you see intellectual disability. What that's saying is that the proportion of participants, high proportion of participants, but relatively moderate or mid-range package size. And then moving to autism, again, relatively high number of participants, but quite low, moderate package size. So it's quite a nice graph to showing you where the money's probably going in terms of the people with disability and the size of that. And a similar but different view is looking at the functional capacity of individuals and the size of package. And a lot of this you would, this is page 16 of your booklet, a lot of this you would sort of intuitively know probably is that the average annualised support package for people with high functional capacity are quite low, whereas with low functional capacity, quite high. You'll see that there is a variation, obviously, if you look at functional capacity 10 and 11, you kind of go, well, why is that happening? I think this probably, don't be too scientific, sort of cluster a bit more and think of it in the general trend. I'm just going to touch on plan data, activation and utilisation, because they're quite tricky concepts in the, but they're really important, and I think they'll be increasingly important with time, but might not be so relevant right now. So this is page 17 of the booklet. So activation is the length of time it takes for a participant, in essence, a participant's plan to start. Now, for it to start, it's the first invoice received by the NDIA for supports from the first provider. So it's not that the person may well have been receiving services for some time, but the first invoice has got through and the payment's made. That's when it's classified as activated. Because it's really no other way that the NDIA can do it, I wouldn't think. So but you need to understand that to understand what that statistic means. So plan activation for quarter 1, 2 and 3 is 55% of approved plans are activated in less than 30 days. So that's pretty prompt. 73% within 90 days and 20% are not yet activated. Now, we need to be a wee bit careful with the 20% not yet activated because it's quarter 1, 2 and 3. So it's just into that stat is at the end of June. So there could be people who got their plan at the end of the third quarter, haven't quite activated their plan. So that may not be a dramatic statistic, although I think in the diagram we do have identified that there are quite a number of people's plans who have not been activated and they had their plan approved in the first quarter. So clearly there's either issues in terms of getting their plan getting their first services arranged, or they've got their plan and they're just sitting waiting. Utilisation is another one that's important to understand, and Reece and I will have a conversation about these shortly. The amount of funding, utilisation is trying to describe what the actual expenditure is against the predicted. So the plan has a value. The NDIA say in this period where 6 months of that plan you would expect to be expended, how much has been invoiced for and paid for. So that's showing that for Queensland, that's a 44% expenditure. So it connects to the activation, because if you haven't activated your plan, nothing's been spent against it. The slower that happens, the slower those proportions work. But it also gets played out, I think, in that whole starting of a scheme and the fact that we are first year. You see the national average is 59%. That 59% possibly reflects that quite a large number of participants are in the scheme and have been in the scheme for quite some time in those other states through the trials. So that will be affecting their average and drawing it up. The utilisation is expected to significantly improve. And part of that will just be that the calculation is more reliable than perhaps it is at the moment. And the last one on the screen that I just thought I'd touch on is that who manages plans. So currently of the Queensland plans, 70% are agency managed, 13% plan manager managed, self-managed partly 10% and 7% fully self-managed. We've put some definitions and descriptors in the diagram in the booklet around this to make it a little easier to understand some of them. But I think the key point that I wanted to raise here was that 93% of participants at this stage will purchase some of their services from a registered provider, so being registered with the NDIA if you wish to be in the business of delivering to the scheme, to participants is a very important aspect, although there is obviously that avenue with self-managed participants. So, Reece, is there anything on this space?
I think there's a lot to discuss on all of that, which is great, right? Gives us a lot of insight, but certainly some things we've discussed over time are some mistakes that you can make when you're looking at some of the data and drawing insight. So the first one for me are the types of supports in plan data, and probably most concerning is the capacity building area, right? So given the purpose of the scheme, and in particular that employment line for us, that's something we've really looked at CPL. And part of that, I think, has to do with the HUDAS, because that assessment doesn't really open up a good conversation around employment and seen as something that's very black and white. You're either employed or you're not. You've got a job or you don't, as opposed to capacity building, which is about creating pathways to employment and economic participation. And so I think we can certainly see the core activities, all the core stuff is, quite large, which is great. And that's, as we're seeing it, as that transitions, but just, I guess, hopeful as an organisation, but as a sector too, that we start to see those capacity building areas start to move in second plans and in future plans as well. And I think you can kind of marry up this one here with how the funding is being, attributed across different graphs.
Yes.
So if we go to that one, plan data by funding level of function, because this was the conversation that you and I kind of had previously as well. Yeah. So that high functional capacity is probably some of those capacity building areas as well, where we're seeing that not come through. But one of the things that we were looking at, and we looked at the dashboard stuff nationally and compared that with Queensland, did a quick back of the envelope. So we know that at the end of June, we had 4.7 billion already committed to about 90,000 participants. And when we look at the bilateral numbers and we extrapolate those out and do a high level, then what I was coming up with was that the NDIS is going to cost $30.5 billion in full scheme, and that's over budget from the 22 billion. And so panic stations, disaster, it's not going to work. But when you and I had a conversation, you were talking about something quite different.
Well, I just made the point that the majority of participants that are rolling in, certainly for Queensland, are existing participants. So they're people probably that have, the only way to get into the existing system was to have very high need, and and high support need. And so the packages were probably proportionally much greater for those existing participants than they would be for new participants rolling in. Now, that's not to say there won't be participants out there that are new and other participants who will need quite high support packages. But probably the majority are actually much lower in terms of the support needs. They do need some support, but they'll be lower.
So then when you do another high-level analysis, it actually starts to fall well within budget. But once again, I'm not an actuary and I don't work for Treasury, so don't rely on my figures or calculations. But it's one example, I guess, where when you're looking at data and you're doing the analytics, the insights that you can draw from that and the incorrect conclusions that you can create. So shouldn't always be sort of relying on one assumption, but rather modelling several assumptions and scenarios around then how you take this data, model it for your business. Let's talk about plan activation and utilisation, because it's only one slide, but it's huge, right? And so I think when we look at that, we kind of think, oh, well, that's okay. 55% of the business or 73% of business is being paid within 90 days. And we can draw assumptions around cash flow, forecasting and modelling to say, well, that's great how it works. But your definition of what is an activation or when someone becomes active is when that first invoice is claimed. And so you could have participants with a number of different service providers or number of different services that they're claiming. And so they might successfully claim an invoice for an allied health intervention, but are yet to invoice for SIL or their supported independent living. And so I think it's important not to just focus on those numbers and think that that's going to help with your cash flow forecasting. I think there's a number of challenges that we have as providers that come to activation. I'm just trying to look at some of my notes here. I think we probably will get to a point where providers, certainly in Queensland, we've been really supportive of this transition, and I think that's why we've been so successful as well, transitioning existing people in. But we will reach a point, I think, where we have to stop being so kind around plan sign-up and signing up to our services because we're carrying through that transition. It'll reach a point where that just becomes unaffordable, and so we'll have to start being a little bit more stricter around getting people to sign up. I think it's also about having a different conversation too when we are doing planning around information. I've heard from other providers as well around the advice that participants are getting around just choose a provider for 3 months and sign up. And so that's so that you can continue to have choice and control. Whereas most providers have service agreements that allow people to exit that contract and that agreement really easily. And so continuing to go back and assemble an agreement and then assemble it again in 3 months' time, that's adding additional administrative burden and overhead to providers. And so as we start to find ways to meet the NDIA price, to design our system, it's really about changing that conversation that you have choice and control and you can change your agreements at any time. And the other thing I think when we're looking at this plan activation and the money that's coming in is around switching costs. And so unlike any other industry, we hold the cost of switching. And so when a participant or a consumer wants to change providers, whilst there's a small amount of money there for that, it's not enough, we hold that switching cost. And so it's around how we can start to do that better and start to really monitor what's happening with that. Let's talk about utilisation, because this was the one I think that sparked my interest at QTAG when we had this conversation. And so as we move now to block grant, and now we're sort of working by consumer with our funding. We were always, conscious of the utilisation of our block grants, of our state government funding, just as we are with our participants. And so, if we get caught up into this mindset of, well, we've signed up a person's plan for 12 months that's of this value, this figure in particular is really important to us as an industry because it says, well, maybe now I should only be calculating 44% of that value in my pipeline. So otherwise, I have overestimated my service revenue or my cash flow forecasting, and so I need to draw that back and start to be a little bit more conservative. And then, what is it that's driving that utilisation? Is it around lag in terms of how that's being reported, or is it around people not wanting to spend all of their plan or not being able to access the services in their location that the plan sort of outlines? And so I think that regular reviewing of utilisation is really important if we're going to get to the predicted 75% plan utilisation.
And I think just on that point is that utilisation, it might be that the utilisation in your service and the service that you're providing to that participant might be quite high. It's just that other aspects of the person's plan they haven't either yet started or identified a provider for. So the utilisation is quite a tricky one. And it's as we get more information and better information, we'll try and unpack that for you. But it's it's your own businesses and your own interactions in the scheme are going to find that out as you flow.
Yeah, I think it's important, though, to not view that as people are being overfunded in their plan and they're getting more services than they really need. I'm pretty sure that's not the assumption we're making here around utilisation at all. That's pretty much all I had in terms of questions. Come and abuse me in the session if you don't think I was harsh enough. But thank you.
Thanks, Reece. So just to summarise that, the majority of funding is committed to core supports, as you would probably expect. 73% of plans are actually activated in 90 days, so the activation is reasonably prompt, but 90 days is still 3 months. And 44% plan utilisation, which is, again, quite a tricky number. Now, the last... doing reasonably well on timing, that's good. The last slide I just wanted to touch on was really just the remaining rollout schedule, which I'm sure you're all aware of, but I just thought I'd restate it. So for year 2, Ipswich, Lockyer, Scenic Rim and Somerset has started. It did in fact start in early May, and as I said earlier, some of the numbers were counted in the first year, but I haven't provided any particular details on that because it was only 6 weeks worth of data and it was the early draw forward. Bundaberg, 1 October, and again there is some early transition happening there now from 1 September. Rockhampton, Gladstone, west of the borders, 1 January through to 30 June. Now, that end date that's on there is particularly important for existing participants, but as we've kind of mentioned through this, other participants will continue to roll in beyond that time, and it's pretty obvious from some of those graphs that it's a pretty consistent, albeit relatively slow flow. It'll carry on. Then in year 3, which we describe as the blockbuster year, so Fraser Coast, North Burnett, South Burnett and Cherbourg kick off in July, and that's a 6-month transition. So that links very much to the Bundaberg and Rockhampton areas, and that is, but that particular area is actually part of NDIA Central Queensland. So I've clustered these areas by the NDIA areas because that's an important point for you in terms of who your main interaction will be with. So for the NDIA Central Queensland, we've got Fraser Coast and surrounds from 1 July to 31 December. Brisbane suburbs, which in the bilateral is described as north and south, so it's 2 areas in the bilateral, but the greater of those is from 1 July to 30 June, so that's the full year. And then Moreton Bay, including Strathpine, Caboolture, and Sunshine Coast, Noosa and Gympie are from 1 January 19 to 30 June 19, so that's a very condensed period for that North Coast area. For NDIA area, Queensland South area, we've got the Logan and Redlands and the Gold Coast and Hinterland, so it's that big southeast corner. Both starting 1 July 18 to 31 March 19. So probably from an NDIA perspective, they'll roll those 2 areas together, but in the bilateral, they are identified as 2 different areas. And then from 1 July to 30 June, we've got Cairns, Cassowary Coast, Tablelands, Croydon, Etheridge, Cape York, I was about to say Cape Town, wrong country, and Torres Strait. And that's a full year, and that's for the NDIA Queensland North area. So NDIA Queensland North have actually, by the end of this financial year, the majority of the area will have transitioned in, and they'll be focusing on that far north Queensland area. And it's really, you might say, well, it's a relatively low numbers in that area, but it's a huge geographic spread, and that's why it was put over the full year to allow the access into those communities over that period of time. And that was pretty much all I was going to say. So I think I'm 5 minutes early, but that's probably okay. That just means you get to get coffee slightly earlier. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Geraldine. And before we do go for a tea break, can I just get you all to thank Geraldine and Rhys for their very stimulating presentation. Without holding you back from that cup of tea, I think one of the things that's become really obvious as a result of looking at the numbers and doing deeper dives from time to time is there is so many different definitions, and there is very much a supply chain of information that comes from when people first touch the system through to when they might be getting services at a later stage. But one of the things I wouldn't mind just adding to the conversation without diving into that presentation is that when Geraldine mentioned that 7,249 approved plans at the end of June, it's interesting to highlight, and this is always really important from a provider's perspective, but you may not have had line of sight to this, but the quarterly data does provide this window, is that there was a further 3,382 people with an access decision pending and a further 1,342 in the planning pipeline. So even though the number was 7,249, there was 3,382 coming through and a further 1,342 coming through as well. So this is the story behind that is that this is a mechanism in terms of the way people get their access decisions made, get their planning decisions taken, and indeed a pipeline of information coming forward. So when you see one number, always make sure you just look at the life cycle around that, if you know what I mean. So look, we've got some great speakers coming up after the tea break and leading us through until lunchtime, and then we've got that panel discussion after lunch, which I'm sure everyone will enjoy as well. But look, can I just remind you to be timely with our tea break. If you could all be back in the room here at 11:15. Our speakers have been terrific keeping things on schedule. I didn't have to use the big hook to pull them off the stage. But thank you for that, and indeed could you enjoy the morning tea and be back in the room seated by 11:15. Thank you.